I was standing in the third row of the observation gallery, close enough to smell ozone off the shield generators, when a 19-year-old girl from Ohio looked up at 7 feet of Drakeith War Marshal and said, "No." Just that, no. The whole chamber went quiet in a way I'd never heard before. Not the polite quiet of a classroom. The quiet of 2,000 beings realizing all at once that something had gone very wrong for somebody, and it wasn't going to be her. I need to tell you how we got there. Set up. The Caledry Academy sits on a ring station above a gas giant nobody bothered to name properly, just called Junction 9 because 5 hyperlanes cross there. If you've never been inside a ring station, picture a city built sideways, wrapped around empty air, with the stars turning slow overhead like a ceiling fan nobody remembers switching on. I worked maintenance on Deck 7, which meant I saw everything and nobody saw me. Best job in the galaxy if you like watching people. Deck 7 housed the Joint Species Combat Theory Program, the fancy name for a school where every major power in the Concord sent their brightest kids to learn how not to start wars, and failing that, how to win them. Drakeith cadets built like tanks, vests with their 4 arms and their habit of finishing your sentences before you did. Corin, silent little insectoid things who communicated half in pheromones. And 3 years back, humanity had finally been allowed to send students. 2 seats, just 2. One of them was a girl named Mara Okonkwo Hale. She didn't look like much, not at first. Average height, dark hair always pulled back tight, the kind of tired eyes you get from studying too late. She wore the same gray academy jacket everyone else wore, no rank markings yet, no reputation. When she walked the corridors that first month, the older cadets didn't sneer at her. Something worse, they didn't notice her at all. Humans were new. Humans were, in the Concord's quiet reckoning, the weak cousins. We'd been given exactly 2 seats because the VES ambassador had argued, and I heard this from a tech who'd bugged the negotiation chamber for maintenance diagnostics, that humanities, combat philosophy, showed unusual promise despite obvious physiological deficits. Obvious physiological deficits. That's diplomat speak for soft, slow, and short-lived. Mara's roommate was a Corin named TZLSSO, who by the second week had taken to translating for her in class, not because Mara couldn't understand Concord Standard, she spoke it fine, better than fine, but because the professors had a habit of talking past human students like they were background noise that happened to be enrolled. I remember the first time I really looked at her. Middle of the night cycle, Deck 7 empty except me running diagnostics on a coolant line, and there she was in the observation lounge, alone, staring out at the gas giant storms, a data slate balanced on her knee covered in notes. Tactical doctrine, Drakeith siege patterns, old human military history. I caught a page about somebody named Zhukov before she noticed me and flipped it shut, embarrassed, like I'd caught her doing something private. "Can't sleep?" I asked her. "Studying," she said, then quieter. "Everyone here already knows all of this. I'm starting from zero." I didn't know what to say to that. I just nodded and went back to my coolant line, but I thought about it a long time after. Starting from zero, on a station full of species who'd been fighting wars, real wars, void wars, planet-cracking wars, since before humans figured out bronze. She wasn't starting from zero because she was slow. She was starting from zero because nobody had bothered translating 4,000 years of human strategy into Concord doctrine yet. She was doing it herself, at night, alone. Build tension. The trouble started with the Drakeith. You have to understand the Drakeith Empire the way everyone in the Concord understands it, not with hatred, exactly, more like the wary respect you'd give a hurricane. They didn't join the Concord because they believed in it. They joined because losing 3 wars in a row to a coalition tends to change your mind about diplomacy. But old habits don't die. Drakeith cadets at the academy were sent there specifically to test the other species, to probe, to find the soft places. Their star pupil was a war marshal's son named Corvith Drawn. Big, even by Dracoth standards, nearly 7 feet, plated shoulders, a voice that came from somewhere down in his chest like distant thunder. He'd already won every simulated engagement the Academy threw at him. He walked the corridors like he owned the station's gravity itself. He'd been ignoring Mara for a month. Then one day in strategic theory, their professor, a Vess named Instructor Haveth, 4 arms folded in that patient way Vess have put up a case study. A defensive engagement. Outnumbered force, no reinforcements coming, a choke point that had to be held. Cadet Drawn, Haveth said. Your solution. Corvith stood and I watched him from the gallery. I'd started sneaking up there on my breaks, I'll admit it, because something about that class had started pulling at me. He laid out an answer that was, by every Dracoth textbook, flawless. Concentrate force. Break the enemies will through overwhelming violence at the point of contact. Accept losses as the cost of victory. It was aggressive, it was confident, and half the room nodded along, because it was the doctrine they'd all been raised on. Haveth turned. Cadet Okonkwo, do you concur? Mara stood slowly. I remember she didn't look nervous. She looked like she was choosing her words the way you choose a path across ice. No, she said, I don't. You could feel the room shift. Corvith turned in his seat slow, the way a gun turret turns. The scenario says no reinforcements are coming, Mara said. So every soldier Marshal Drawn spends today, he doesn't get back. If he wins by attrition, he wins an empty choke point. There's nobody left to hold it tomorrow. There is no tomorrow if you lose today, Corvith said. First words he'd ever spoken directly to her. Flat, almost bored. There's no tomorrow if you win today and can't hold it either, Mara said. You're not fighting a battle, you're fighting a war. There's a difference. Haveth's antennae twitched, Vess version of raised eyebrows. Explain your alternative, Cadet. And she did, fighting withdrawal, layered defense, 3 fallback lines instead of 1. Trading ground for time, time for reinforcement, reinforcement for the win that actually mattered, the one 3 days later, when the real relief force arrived. She sketched it on the display with her stylus, hands steady, voice getting stronger with every sentence like she was finally standing on solid ground instead of ice. You are describing retreat, Corvith said, and there was something almost insulted in it. I'm describing survival, Mara said. Your ancestors would call it weakness. Mine call it Thermopylae. 300 men held a pass for 3 days against an army that outnumbered them 100 to 1. They didn't win the battle. They won the war because the delay let everyone behind them prepare. Sometimes losing well is how you win big. Nobody said anything for a second. I watched Corvith's jaw, if that's even what to call it, tighten. Humans, he said, have fought wars for what, 6,000 years? My people have fought for 600,000. You lecture me on strategy learned in a nursery. I'm not lecturing you, Mara said. I'm telling you the nursery got some things right that 600,000 years of winning battles let you forget. Haveth wisely ended class there. That was the day the whole academy started talking about the human girl on deck 7. Some of it was respect. A lot of it, especially from the Dracoth cadets, was something closer to insult. The sense that a soft, short-lived species had no business correcting an empire that measured its wars in centuries. I didn't think much more of it. Kids argue in class, I told myself. It happens. I went back to my coolant lines. I was wrong about how far it would go. 3 weeks later, the Dracoth military attaché, not a cadet, an actual serving officer, a colonel named Vashter with scarring down one side of his face that told you he'd seen real war, not simulated, arrived on the station for what the academy called a doctrine evaluation. Officially, it was routine. Every so often the conquered powers sent officers to observe the cadets and make sure the academy was actually producing something useful. Unofficially, and I heard this from 3 different sources, because gossip travels faster than light on a station this size. Colonel Vashtor had come specifically because of the human girl. Word had reached the Dracoth High Command, through Corvith's own reports home, that a human cadet was openly contradicting Dracoth military doctrine in open class and winning arguments doing it. The Dracoth Empire does not enjoy being contradicted, especially not by a species they consider, at best, an interesting experiment the Conquered was running. Vashtor requested, which on a station like this means demanded politely, a live evaluation exercise, not a simulation on a screen. A full sensory combat simulation, the kind used to certify actual field officers, run in the deep simulation chamber on Deck 3, the one with the neural rigs that make you feel the cold, feel the fear, feel your own pulse hammering like it's real, because to your nervous system it is. He wanted to test Mara directly, publicly, in front of the whole senior class, in front of observers from 4 conquered powers, in front of Corvith Drawn. The academy administrator, an old Torvani named Director Sen who'd run the place for 30 years, tried to talk him down. I know because I was doing electrical work outside his office, and the door wasn't as soundproof as it should have been. She is 19 years old, Sen said, a first-year cadet. This is not an appropriate evaluation for a colonel of the Empire to conduct. She has publicly criticized Dracoth doctrine in an open classroom, Vashtor said. My government would like to understand whether that criticism reflects genuine strategic insight, or whether it reflects a species that does not yet understand its place in this Conquered. That is not the purpose of this institution. Then perhaps, Vashtor said, and his voice went very quiet, the kind of quiet that's worse than shouting. The purpose of this institution should be reconsidered by those of us who fund half its seats. Sen caved, not because he wanted to, because a Dracoth colonel implying he'd pull funding for 4 other species seats is not a threat any administrator can shrug off. Mara was informed the next morning. I heard from TZLSSO, who I'd struck up a strange little friendship with by then, that Mara didn't say anything when they told her, just nodded and asked what scenario she'd be run against. They told her, a full-scale Dracoth siege doctrine run by Colonel Vashtor himself playing the offense. She would command the defense, real neural simulation, real pressure readings on her vitals monitored by the whole room, no pause button, no do-over. You don't have to do this, TZLSSO told her that night in their shared quarters. I wasn't there, obviously, but TZLSSO told me about it later, and I believe every word because TZLSSO wasn't the type to embellish. You could request a postponement. Cite unpreparedness. If I do that, Mara said, every human who ever tries to sit in these 2 seats after me walks in already smaller than they were. I'm not doing that to them. You could lose. I could, Mara said, but I'm not going to lose because I was scared to show up. Climax. The day of the evaluation, Deck 3's observation gallery was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Every species with a seat at the academy had sent someone. VES instructors with their 4 arms folded. A cluster of Quarren, pheromone quiet but clearly agitated, their antennae all tilted the same direction like a field of grass in wind. 2 other human cadets from the junior class, faces pale. And Corvith Drawn, front row, arms crossed, watching with an expression I couldn't read, not quite satisfaction, not quite something else. I wasn't supposed to be there. I told my supervisor the environmental scrubbers on Deck 3 needed inspecting. He didn't check. I stood at the back near the maintenance access, close enough to see the main display, close enough to see Mara's face when she walked in. She looked terrified. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters more than if she'd walked in looking fearless. She looked like a 19-year-old about to be evaluated by a war colonel in front of 2,000 people from 5 species who mostly thought her species didn't belong here. Her hands were steady. Her face wasn't. Colonel Vashter was already seated at the command interface on the opposite side, scarred face unreadable, 4 Dracoth officers behind him as witnesses. Director Sen stood between them, looking like a man watching a car crash he had no power to stop. "The scenario," Vashter announced, and his voice carried through the whole chamber without him raising it, "is Cedra Outpost, a conquered border station. Population 11,000 civilians, 400 defense personnel. My forces will conduct a full siege assault. Cadet Okonkwo commands the defense. Standard rules of engagement. Neural simulation to full sensory fidelity." Mara sat at her console. A technician fitted the neural rig, a thin silver band across her temple, and I saw her hands tighten once on the console edge before she made herself let go. "Cadet," Sen said gently, "you may still decline." "I'm ready," Mara said. The chamber lights dimmed. The big display flickered to life, showing what Mara would be seeing inside the simulation, because they'd routed a mirror feed to the gallery, I think specifically so everyone could watch her fail or succeed in real time. The simulation dropped her into Cedra Outpost's command bunker. Sirens, red emergency lighting, a tactical map showing Dracoth assault ships already breaking atmosphere. Her console readouts, heart rate, stress markers, appeared in a corner of the gallery display, and I watched her pulse spike the second the sirens hit. "Contact in 90 seconds, a simulated voice said in her ear. I could hear it too, piped to the gallery speakers. "Orders, Commander." For 3 seconds she said nothing. 3 seconds doesn't sound long. In that room with 2,000 beings holding their breath, it felt like a year. Then her voice came through, and it wasn't shaking anymore. "Evacuate civilian sectors 4 through 9 to the deep shelters. Now. Defense personnel, fall back from the perimeter wall to the secondary line. I want the wall's sensors and comms stripped and destroyed before we abandon it. Don't leave them anything." "Commander, abandoning the perimeter this early." "I know what it looks like," Mara said. "Do it." Vashter, on his side, launched the assault exactly like the doctrine Corvith had recited in class weeks earlier. Overwhelming force, straight at the strongest point, meant to break the defender's will in the first engagement. His assault ships tore into the outer perimeter, the perimeter Mara had already abandoned. I watched his jaw tighten just slightly on the display feed showing his own reactions. He'd expected to meet resistance there. Meeting nothing wasn't in his doctrine. "She ceded the wall," someone behind me murmured. A Dracoth cadet, not Corvith, sounding almost gleeful. "She's already lost the perimeter." "Watch," TZLSSO said quietly from somewhere near me. I hadn't realized she'd come to stand close by. Vashter pushed his forces forward into the outpost proper, expecting a collapsing defense he could crush. Instead, his assault ships hit chokepoints Mara had spent the last 2 minutes reinforcing, corridors deliberately narrowed with pre-positioned barricades, sightlines she'd stripped of cover on his approach and stacked with cover on her own side. His numbers meant nothing in a corridor 3 meters wide. "She's not defending the outpost," Corvith said, low from the front row, and I heard something change in his voice. "Not mockery anymore. She's turning it into a kill box." Vashter adapted. He was a real colonel, not a fool, and split his force, tried to flank through the lower maintenance levels to bypass her chokepoints entirely. And that's when Mara did something that made the whole gallery go dead silent. She'd already evacuated the civilians 3 levels below where everyone assumed. Not to the deep shelters directly under the outpost, which was the obvious move. The move Vashter's flanking force was routing toward, expecting empty tunnels. She'd rerouted them in the first 90 seconds, through an old service tunnel to a secondary shelter half a kilometer off-site. A detail buried in the outpost schematics that even some of the Dracoth officers behind Vashter hadn't clocked. His flanking force hit the original shelter tunnels and found them empty, and worse than empty, collapsed. Mara had ordered them demolished the second the civilians cleared. sealing his flanking route into a dead end with no way through and no way back except the way he'd come, straight into the choke points she'd been reinforcing the entire time his attention was elsewhere. She baited him, a VES instructor said, somewhere behind me, sounding almost delighted despite themselves. She let him think the civilians were the objective. They were the objective. That's what made it so brutal. Vastor had assumed, because Dracoth doctrine assumes, that a defender protects assets by holding ground over them. Mara had understood that the only asset that actually mattered was the 11,000 people, and the second they were safe, every other decision became purely about cost. She spent walls. She spent sensors. She spent ground freely, like a person throwing away things she never needed, because none of it was the thing she was actually defending. Vastor's assault stalled in the corridors. His casualties simulated, but the system logged everyone with cold precision on the display, climbed past acceptable thresholds. Dracoth doctrine calls for withdrawal at 40% losses. He hit 41 and kept pushing, and I understood, watching his face on the mirrored feed, that he wasn't fighting the scenario anymore. He was fighting the fact that a 19-year-old human girl had outthought him in front of his own officers. That's when Mara made her final call. "All units, secondary line, hold and fire," she said. "Colonel's committed everything he has left to the choke points. He can't disengage without exposing his flank to our reserve." "Commander, we don't have a reserve." "We do," Mara said. "It's every civilian defense volunteer I pulled off perimeter duty 2 minutes in and staged in sub-level 3. They're not soldiers. They don't need to be. They just need to be visible on his sensors for 40 seconds. She'd built a bluff. A real one with real bodies on real sensor returns, not a trick of the display, actual armed volunteers, positioned to look exactly like a flanking reserve force. Because in Dracoth doctrine, at 41% losses with an apparent reserve force revealing itself on your flank, there is exactly one correct call: withdraw. Vastor hesitated 4 full seconds. On the gallery display, I watched his own stress readout spike harder than it had the entire engagement. Then he pulled his forces back. The simulation ran the disengagement sequence, Dracoth assault ships breaking off, retreating to orbit, the outpost status flipping from critical to secure across every screen in the gallery. 11,000 simulated civilians alive. 400 defense personnel, minus the losses at the perimeter she'd already written off before the fight even started, losses she'd planned for. The lights came back up. For a second nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I don't think anyone in that gallery, human or otherwise, quite knew what to do with what they'd just watched. Then Colonel Vastor stood up from his console, and his face, that scarred, unreadable Dracoth face, had something on it I hadn't expected. Not anger. Something closer to the look of a man who's just been handed a piece of information he's going to be thinking about for a long time. He crossed the chamber floor toward Mara's console. She stood, pulling the neural rig off her temple, hands not quite steady now that it was over. I saw that, the little tremor, the human cost of holding still under that much pressure for 11 straight minutes. "You abandoned the perimeter in the first 90 seconds, Vastor said. "Every Dracoth cadet in this room was taught that ceding ground is the first sign of a broken commander." "I wasn't defending ground," Mara said. "I was defending people. The ground was never the objective. You just didn't know that until it was too late to matter." Vastor looked at her for a long moment. "Where," he said slowly, "did you learn this doctrine? And this is the part I need you to understand, because it's the part that changed everything that happened next." Mara didn't say a conquered military academy. She didn't cite some galactic strategist with 6 centuries of campaigns behind him. She looked Vastor dead in the eye, this girl who'd been treated for a month like an afterthought her species had no business affording, and she said, "In history, we've been losing wars and learning from it for 6,000 years, Colonel. We don't have your numbers. We don't have your ships. We never could afford to fight the way you fight, spend lives, spend ground, win through sheer weight. So we learned a different math. We learned to make the thing the enemy wants to take the hardest thing to actually hold. You didn't lose today because I was clever. You lost because your whole doctrine assumes an enemy who fights fair on your terms with your math. I never agreed to your math. That's when Corvith Dron stood up. I watched him do it, saw him rise out of his seat in the front row, all 7 feet of him, and for one terrible second I thought, this is where it turns ugly. This is where a war marshal's son puts a human cadet back in her place in front of everyone. Instead, he walked to the center of the floor, stood in front of Mara. She had to look up at him. And she did, chin level, not backing away an inch, and he said, loud enough for the whole gallery to hear. I called your strategy retreat 3 weeks ago. I was wrong. It was never retreat. It was patience with teeth. And then, to everyone's shock, including mine, I'd swear to this, Colonel Vashtor's, Corvith Dron inclined his head. Not a bow, not quite. But close enough that every Draketh officer in that room understood exactly what it meant. Because I later learned that gesture is reserved, in Draketh military tradition, for an equal acknowledging an equal in combat. He'd given it to a 19-year-old human girl from Ohio. Resolution. The gallery didn't erupt into applause, not exactly. That's not really the Concord style. Too many species with too many different customs for cheering. But I heard something else. A low murmur running through the whole crowd, Vess antennae all tilting the same way at once, Corin pheromone signals shifting so strong even I could half smell the change in the air. Something the translators later told me roughly meant collective, startled respect. Colonel Vashtor requested, formally, through Director Sen, that Mara's engagement be logged and forwarded to Draketh Imperial Military Command, not as a curiosity, but as a case study. He told Sen, and Sen told me later over a drink I probably shouldn't have been sharing with an academy director, that it was the first time in his 30-year career he'd seen a Draketh officer request that an alien cadet's tactics be taught in Imperial academies. Humans have fought each other for 6,000 years, Vashtor reportedly said, learning to survive against enemies stronger than themselves. We have fought for 600,000 years learning how to be the stronger enemy. I begin to wonder which lesson serves better, when the wars finally stop being simulations. The 2 human seats at the academy became 4 the following term, then 8 the year after. I'm told, though I never confirmed it myself, that it was Vashtor's report that tipped that decision, not the Concord Council's usual glacial deliberation. Mara didn't change much in the weeks after. That surprised me most of all. I expected her to walk different, talk different, carry herself like someone who just outthought an imperial colonel in front of the whole academy. She didn't. I still saw her some nights in that same observation lounge, data slate on her knee, studying like she still had everything to prove. Because, she told me once, when I finally worked up the nerve to ask her about it directly, she did. One win doesn't change what people expect from a whole species, she said. It just means they're watching now instead of ignoring me. That's not the same as respect. That's just attention. I still have to earn the rest. Corvith started sitting with her sometimes in the mess hall. Not as friends, exactly. Draketh don't do friendship the way we do, but as something like the beginning of it. I heard him ask her once about Thermopylae. She spent 40 minutes telling him about 300 men holding a pass, and he listened the whole time without interrupting once, which for a Draketh war marshal's son might be the single most respectful thing I ever saw him do. Ending line. I still work Deck 7. Still fix coolant lines nobody thanks me for. But every so often, late in the night cycle, I walk past that observation lounge, and I look in, half expecting to see her there, tired eyes, data slate on her knee, learning a galaxy's worth of war from a species that had never fought one anywhere near as long. And I think about what Vashtor said that day. the thing that stuck with me longer than anything else in that whole strange evaluation. He said humanity had spent 6,000 years learning how to survive as the weaker side. He never said it like an insult. By the end, he said it like a warning to everyone else in the room, because the day the weaker side finally stops being weaker, everything they learned surviving becomes something no one else in the galaxy knows how to fight. 6 months after Mara Okonkwo broke a Dracoth colonel's doctrine in a simulation chamber, the Conquered found out what she could do when the guns were real. I wasn't in a gallery this time. I was 3 decks down, running for my life, and so was she. Set up. Junction 9 doesn't get emergencies. That's the whole point of a ring station built on treaty ground, 5 hyperlanes crossing in neutral space. Everyone too invested in the academy sitting there to risk starting anything close to it. I'd worked Deck 7 for 11 years and never once heard the full station alarm. I heard it that day. It started as routine as anything. A Vest trade convoy had requested docking clearance, standard cargo run, nothing flagged. Mara was 2 decks below me at the time, in the lower observation bay with TZLSSO and a knot of other cadets, watching the convoy come in through the viewport the way half the station did when ships arrived, something to do between classes. I was up in the maintenance crawl above Deck 5, replacing a pressure sensor when the docking clamps engaged, and the convoy's outer hull peeled open wrong. Not like cargo doors. Like something built to look like cargo doors from the outside. Raiders, Kesh Clan pirates, we learned later, a loose confederation that worked the edges of conquered space, never bold enough to hit a real target until somebody paid them enough to try Junction 9 during a lull in station security rotation. 40, maybe 50 armed boarders, and they hit the lower decks in the first 90 seconds, right where 200 unarmed cadets and a skeleton security detail happened to be standing. The alarm didn't come fast enough. I remember that most of all, the silence before it, the 2 or 3 seconds where I looked down through the crawl grate and saw people running before I understood why. Build tension. Here's the thing nobody tells you about a school full of the galaxy's future military officers. Most of them, on the day it actually happens, are 19 years old and have never held a real weapon in their lives. The academy taught doctrine. It taught simulations. It did not teach 200 unarmed teenagers what to do when boarders with real guns come through a cargo bay screaming in a dialect the translators lagged behind on. I got down through the maintenance shaft as fast as I could, because that's not bravery, that's just where my ladder led, and what I found in the lower observation bay was chaos. Real chaos, not the simulated kind, cadets pressed against the far bulkhead, a security officer down and bleeding by the door, and the raiders working their way through the bay level by level like they were checking a list. I found out afterward what the list was. Hostages, specifically cadets, because a raid on a diplomatic academy full of the Conquered's next generation of officers isn't worth much as cargo theft, but it's worth an enormous amount as leverage. 50 children of admirals, generals, war marshals, and trade princes packed into 2 lower decks. You don't need to steal anything else. Mara was against that bulkhead with the rest of them. I got close enough, through a service duct, to see her, and I want to tell you she looked calm, the way she had in that simulation chamber 6 months earlier, but she didn't. She looked terrified, same as everyone else. 19 years old, pressed against cold metal with a gun pointed somewhere near her section of the crowd, breathing too fast. But I watched her eyes, and her eyes weren't on the gun. They were moving, counting something. TZLSSO was beside her, antennae flat with fear, pheromones so sharp with distress I could smell them through the duct vent. Corvith Dran was 6 cadets down the line, and I watched him, even a war marshal's son, standing rigid with his hands raised. Because a Dracoth cadet with no weapon against an armed raider is just a target like any other. The raider's leader, a scarred Kesh with a voice like gravel through a grinder, was shouting into a comm unit. Something about terms. Something about the Dracoth and Vess governments. Ransom figures that made the security officer by the door make a small, sick sound even through his blood loss. That's when Myra moved, not toward the door, not toward a weapon. She stepped half a pace forward from the line, hands still raised, and said, loud enough to cut through the Raider leader's shouting, "You're doing the math wrong." Climax. Everything in that bay stopped for a second. The Raider leader turned toward her, guns swinging with him, and I nearly came through that duct vent right then. I was so sure I was about to watch her die. "You want ransom for military cadets," Mara said, and her voice was shaking. I could hear it, but she kept talking anyway. "But you took hostages from 4 governments at once. The second you send that demand, every one of those governments has to decide whether to negotiate with you or look weak in front of the other 3. None of them can afford to look weak. Not to each other. You didn't create leverage. You created a room where every government in this Concord has more reason to burn this station down around you than to pay you a single credit." "Shut her up," the Raider leader snapped to one of his men, and a boarder started toward her, weapon rising, and I swear my heart stopped in my chest. "Kill me and you've killed a human cadet in front of 3 other governments' children," Mara said, faster now, because she knew exactly how little time she had. "That's not leverage either. That's a war crime with 50 witnesses. You're not pirates anymore the second that shot fires. You're a target every fleet in 5 sectors gets permission to hunt without paperwork." The boarder stopped, not because he wanted to, because his leader had raised one clawed hand, slow thinking. "What," the Raider leader said, "do you suggest, little human?" And here is the part I still don't fully understand, the part I've turned over in my head 100 times since. Mara didn't offer a negotiation. She didn't buy time hoping for rescue. She looked at that Raider leader and she offered him an exit. "Take 1 hostage," she said. "Just 1. Someone whose government will pay fast and quiet without turning this into a Concord-wide incident because their family doesn't need the political spectacle of a rescue. Let the other 49 go. You get paid. You get gone before any fleet organizes a response. Everyone else in this Concord gets to write it up as a small incident instead of a massacre, and small incidents don't get hunted for a decade." "And who," the Raider leader said, "is that convenient hostage?" Mara didn't hesitate. "Me." I heard TZLSSO make a sound beside her I can't describe, something between a gasp and a cry, pheromones spiking so hard even the Raiders seemed to notice. Corvith's head snapped toward her down the line, and for the first time since I'd known of him, I saw something like open alarm on that plated Dracoth face. "Mara," TZLSSO started. "My family isn't political," Mara said, not looking away from the Raider leader, talking fast now, laying it out like a trade because that's exactly what it was. "I'm not a general's daughter. I'm not a war marshal's son. Human government pays a ransom for me and it's a footnote, not a headline. No fleet gets mobilized over a maintenance family kid from Ohio. You get your money. You get out clean. That's the best deal in this room and you know it." The Raider leader studied her for a long, long moment. I don't know what calculation ran behind those alien eyes, greed, caution, something almost like respect for a good trade offered plainly. But I watched him lower his weapon a fraction. "Bind her," he said. "Release the rest, move." They didn't hurt her taking her. I need you to know that, because I spent the next 11 minutes in that duct with my heart in my throat, imagining every possible way it could go wrong. They cuffed her wrists, walked her toward the boarding ramp, and the other 49 cadets scattered back through the bay doors the second the Raiders let the line break, security finally arriving in force behind them. Alarms screaming full station now, far too late to matter for what had already happened. I lost sight of her through the duct grate as they marched her up the ramp. That's the last I saw of it directly. What happened after, I pieced together from the station logs and from Corvith Drawn himself, weeks later, because he was the one who wouldn't let it end there. The Raiders' ship undocked 11 minutes after taking her, and Junction 9 station security, finally, furiously mobilized, had exactly one conquered vessel close enough to give chase. A Draketh patrol cutter that happened to be running a training circuit 2 systems out. Corvith, I'm told, was the one who calmed that cutter directly, cadet authorization or not, and told them exactly what was happening and exactly who was aboard the Raider ship. She traded herself for 49 people who weren't hers to save, he reportedly said, over an open channel the whole patrol crew heard. If Draketh honor means anything, it means we do not let that trade cost her everything. The cutter caught the Raider vessel 4 hours later at the edge of the system, disabled its drive with a single precision strike that never touched the hull's habitable sections, and boarded before the crew could do anything but surrender. Mara was found in a cargo hold, bound, unhurt, furious rather than frightened by the time they reached her. I heard that detail from the cutter's own captain later, and it made me laugh out loud despite everything, because it sounded exactly like her. Resolution. She came back to Junction 9 2 days later on that same Draketh cutter, and half the academy was waiting on the dock when it arrived. Cadets from every species, Director Sen, Colonel Vashter himself, who'd apparently cut short an inspection tour elsewhere in conquered space the moment he heard what happened. I watched her walk off that ramp, tired, bruised at the wrists where the cuffs had sat too long, and utterly unwilling to accept the word hero from anyone who tried to use it. I didn't save anyone, she told a Vest journalist who'd somehow already gotten wind of the story and made it to the dock. I did math. I found the trade where everyone lived. That's not heroism. That's just refusing to accept the version of the situation where people die, because nobody bothered doing the arithmetic. Colonel Vashter was the one who finally got through to her, standing on that dock in front of everyone. "Cadet," he said, "you offered yourself as collateral to men with guns, based on a calculation you had perhaps 4 seconds to make, with no guarantee of rescue, and no reason to trust that a Draketh cutter would break protocol to save a human cadet who was, by every formal metric, not their responsibility." "It was the right trade," Mara said. "It was," Vashter agreed. "It was also the bravest thing I have witnessed in 40 years of service, and I would ask you not to diminish it simply because the mathematics happen to be sound. Courage and calculation are not opposites, Cadet. You have simply mastered the rare trick of having both at once." Corvith didn't say much that day. He didn't need to. He'd already said everything that mattered over an open comm channel 4 hours from the station, to a patrol cutter crew who then went and proved it true. Ending line. Human enrollment at the academy doubled again after that, not because of a simulation this time. Because word had spread through 5 conquered powers, through officers who'd spent their whole careers measuring courage in fleets and casualties, that somewhere in a maintenance family from Ohio, a species everyone had once called soft had produced a girl who did the hardest math in the galaxy in under 4 seconds, and got the answer that saved everyone but herself. I still work Deck 7. I still see her sometimes, late in the night cycle, data slate on her knee, studying like she still has everything to prove. Maybe she does. Maybe none of us ever really stop having to prove it. But I'll tell you what I think. For whatever a maintenance tech's opinion is worth in a galaxy full of colonels and war marshals, I think the day humanity stops being underestimated is the day the rest of the galaxy finally understands what we already knew back home, the whole 6,000 years, that the ones who survived the longest were never the strongest in the room. They were just the ones who never stopped doing the math for everyone else.